All right, AEMCA mock review. So a couple of things I want to talk about real quick. Almost all the questions on the AEMCA are scenario based. Over 75%, I would say. And that's because the questions they use in the AEMCA are based on actual calls paramedics attend. And the reason they use those is because the AEMCA is meant to be a predictor of your ability to function as a paramedic. Nobody's out to get you. The people who write this test are very, very fair, and they're using real-world scenarios. So what I do for my mock exams is use real-world scenarios and basically try to copy the format as much as possible. What you'll see when we go through this is typical questions, how they show up, and how to prepare for each type of question, because they each have their own kind of challenges. And you'll see the exam is basically a series of scenarios with those questions repeating over and over and over again. So let's jump into it. You're going to be presented a huge amount of information, and especially on the AEMCA. There will be sentences and sentences that have no real purpose to them. They're just there to see how you can look through information and find what is important. The only way to get good at that is to practice it over and over again. So let's start, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Here's what you're going to want to do on every college exam. You should do this, but you should definitely do this on the AEMCA. You're allowed a pencil, you're allowed a highlighter. So when you're going through and you find an important piece of information, underline it. If you find a really important piece of information, highlight it, something, do a star, whatever, some signal that you don't forget later on when you're reading the questions. You're also going to want to, you might have this question on the top of a paper, and then the next 2 pages are questions based on this exam. Well, you want to come back to this scenario constantly before answering each question to make sure you didn't miss anything. It's really difficult to read this once, completely understand all the information. In fact, it's not really possible, so I'll show you what I mean. You are an IV autonomous crew. Well, that's important because now there's no confusion as to your level of practice, which means you're PCP, AIV, and you can do anything in that spectrum of protocols. You are dispatch code 4. That doesn't mean anything, and if you've started preceptorship, you've realized that, especially in Ontario, the dispatch system is, it's not inaccurate, but it's not a very good predictor of what's happening on scene. To a local convenience store for an assault. So that sounds intense, right? Yeah, so you arrive on scene at the same time as OPP. Okay, fine. A bystander states he came into the store and was unable to find the clerk. He eventually peeked over the desk to find the clerk lying supine, that's important, on the floor. That's already quite a bit of information. Oh, and then it goes on with his eyes closed. Bystander states he was unable to wake the patient after shaking him. That's important because what that says is, well, actually that says he was GCS 3. He didn't respond to any stimuli, his eyes were closed, no actual painful stimuli woke him up. Police clear the scene, and that's actually going to come into play later too. Police clear the scene of any dangers, and you and your partner enter the store. Okay, sure. A police officer is over the store clerk attempting to wake him. Okay. You and your partner approach patient and begin your assessment. Okay. Patient is not speaking. Again, we're getting back into description of the behavior of the patient. So he's not speaking. His eyes are open but not tracking. Well, as far as GCS goes, it doesn't matter what his eyes are doing, but it does matter that they're open. You perform a sternal rub. Okay, so that's clearly painful stimuli. And the patient rolls away and his response to painful stimuli. The other police officer states they can't find a weapon and have not found a suspect. Okay, that could mean something. The store appears in order otherwise. That's also kind of weird. So nothing weird about the store. The cops can't find any cop business suggesting an assault. Okay. A physical assessment reveals the following. You estimate that the patient is 30 to 40 years old. Okay, that's always important, and you're always going to have some descriptor of your patient. So this is where you would have age, race, biological sex of the patient. So 30 to 40 years old, and he's a male, and he weighs 100 kilograms. Okay, that's also super important weight, right? So if you get into any actual dosing, they're not going to tell you the patient's weight within the question. You're going to have to come back to the scenario and find it. Patient is snoring. This is crazy important. Okay, and some people either missed that based on the responses to this exam, or they didn't quite understand what that implied. Patient has no obvious trauma to the head or body. Well, that's weird. If you were assaulted, it's not impossible. It's certainly possible to have been assaulted and not have any physical signs of it, but it's weird, especially supposing this guy's unconscious due to trauma. You would suspect he would have some actual contusions, lacerations, abrasions, penetrating injuries, subcutaneous emphysema, all that. You would think he would have something, right? And there's nothing. Patient is incontinent of urine. That's really important finding. Patient has no medical alerts. That sucks. Would be nice to have that. Auscultation is difficult. That's a really important piece of information. Why is it difficult? You are only able to discern that there is air entry in the apices and that you do not hear air entry in the bases. Okay, so what that means is you're unsure of the fact that you don't know if there's adventitious sounds because you can't really hear. The only piece of information you acquired from your auscultation was that air is in the apices and none is in the base. Respirations are labored. That's not good, and that's clearly abnormal. So there's something wrong with this patient's breathing right off the bat. Okay, now let's see his actual vital signs. Heart rate 98. Well, that's technically within normal limits, right? Regular and full. So he's probably normal sinus rhythm just based on that alone, even without an ECG. His respirations are 12. Well, at least the rate is not bad, but they're irregular and they're labored. Again, something's wrong with his respiratory system right now. His SpO2 is 88%. Makes sense. We've already determined he's got labored breathing. His respirations are irregular. Something up with his respiratory system. And his blood pressure, well, it's 112/82. Okay. My paper is full of marks, right? Because all that information is going to become critically important as I move forward, you'll see. Let's see the first question. You notice your patient has some vital signs out of ordinary. Your first step is to, okay, this is a question you're going to see on the AEMCA over and over and over again. Not this exact question, but here's the part you want to focus on. Your first step, your first priority, your first whatever. They're gonna say it in a million different ways, but what they're always saying is, what is the first thing you do? So I always tell students, to be a good paramedic, it's really about prioritizing things. So you could say, oh man, there's all these things wrong with this guy and we need to accomplish all these tasks. Sure, you're correct, but what one do we do now? And then what one do we do next? And then what one do we do next? And then when everything changes, how do we switch that? So how do you determine what is your first step? They've been teaching you that since day one, no matter what college you go to, it doesn't matter. Okay, so when you start in scenarios and you do that A all the way to Z, right? So airway, breathing, circulation, that's the steps in which you are supposed to complete your tasks. Deviation from those steps would probably result in death to your patient or at least serious harm or injury. This is the most basic beginning of those steps. Airway and then breathing all the time, okay? Unless they're VSA or unless you have not assessed them yet and they're unconscious. But really, most of the patients you encounter, it's always going to be ABC, which means airway is your priority. So here are your options. Apply oxygen. Well, we know his sats are 88%, so that is something that needs to happen. He needs oxygen. Apply oxygen with a non-rebreather, or apply low flow oxygen. Okay, gain IV access. That should be a clear, no reason to do that. That should definitely not be your first decision at all. There's no immediate gain from that, and that's so far down the line from a first action. That's a clear detractor. Insert oral airway. Does he need an airway is what you should be asking yourself now, because if he does, the answer is D. If he does not need an airway, then the answer is A or B. Just because you are unconscious doesn't mean you need an airway. That's not an immediate fact. So you need to look for actual reasons to support it. So let's go back to the scenario, and we already looked at this, and we already actually made a big mark on it because it was really, really important, and it's the snoring. So again, snoring is, what is the most common obstruction of the adult airway? The tongue. Snoring is the actual manifestation, the sound that comes from the tongue blocking your airway. So this dude's airway is blocked. That's the first thing you should know when you walk on scene and hear somebody snore. The first thing in your head should be, I need to put in an OPA or NPA or something, or even just do a jaw thrust, but we must fix the airway. And then that would be the first thing you do no matter what, under all circumstances. Yes, I know his sats are low, but why are his sats low? Because of his airway. You can put all the oxygen you want on him in the world, it's not going to matter if his tongue is still blocking his airway. So the answer to that is definitely insert oral airway. Notice there's no choice between oral and nasal airway because it would be pretty much impossible to discern which one would be appropriate and therefore would be an unfair question. About a 50-50 split with the responses I got between nasal cannula and oral airway. So make sure that you always think about prioritization. Now let's say you're weak on that. It will probably show in your scenarios because that's the type of thing that would make you fail a scenario. How can you get better at that? All of the things that your teachers tell you about prioritization, that all comes from basic life support standards. Almost everything about prioritization comes from basic life support standards. So they will tell you how to manage an airway. They will tell you how to manage an emergency. It's long, it's full of information, but that's where they get this actual information to tell you what to do. It's really common. Calculate GCS. You're going to get a bunch of these, and they're always going to be based on your scenario. So you will have the feeling occasionally that the question they gave you, you don't have the information to answer it. I can assure you with 100% certainty, if you get a GCS question, there is enough information within there to calculate the GCS. There absolutely is. If you feel like there isn't, go back to your scenarios, start from ground zero, and mark every single thing that might have to do with patient behavior, and then try to calculate it. Here's another thing. It's not easy to remember your GCS by heart, and it takes a lot of mental energy to do so. So what you should do at the beginning of your exam is write your GCS on your blank piece of paper, which you're allowed to do. You'll be given a blank piece of paper at the AEMCA. So just do eyes, verbal, motor, and then you'll have it, and you can come back to it whenever you get your GCS questions, and it just takes mental energy away, that you can focus on just trying to figure out if you have the right answer. So let's look at the scenario and put together the pieces to actually answer this. Okay, we previously found two pieces of information on here about GCS. There's the bystander's description, which is great, and then there's your physical assessment of the patient. So the way the question is worded is, what is the GCS right now? So the most relevant information we have is from our physical assessment. So let's look at that. Patient is not speaking. Okay, so a 1 on verbal, right? That's a nice easy one. None. None equals 1. Eyes are open, but not tracking. Well, we really just care that they're open as far as the GCS is concerned. And if they're open spontaneously, then that's a 4. Okay, so that's 5. You perform a sternal rub, that's clearly painful stimuli, and the patient rolls away. So that would be withdraw from pain. So we have for motor, none, which would be 1. We have deseverate posturing, decorticate posturing, and then withdraw. That's 4. So 4 plus 4 plus 1 is 9. Now let's see if that's an actual option, make sure we're correct. And it is, right? So then you would pick 9. Generally, I like to go back and reread it and do this a couple times because it's kind of a give me question. There's not much thinking required. You just have to apply the GCS to the patient, but it's easy to make a mistake with these questions and they're easy points.